Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Texas Public Policy Foundation's 20th Annual Policy Orientation Conference. My name is Robert Henneke. I'm so thrilled to serve as the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. Thank you for being with us. We're going to throw fastballs down the middle with this first panel and really have an exciting discussion, and I'm thrilled to have you all join us. I have to first announce, to check the box, that this is a CLE accredited discussion. So if you're an attorney and you need to get continuing legal education credit, there's a sign up in the back. This has been accredited, and so it counts. So I'm going to kick things off, and we're here for the My Body, My Choice panel. We're here for the Jab or Your Job panel to talk about the concept of the vaccine mandates and to update you on where things stand with the recent litigation, where things stand with the policy in general, and to have a spirited and robust discussion about this issue and the constitutional dimensions and the intrusion upon individual liberty. You know, I'm going to set the marker with my position that any kind of government policy that requires you to take a medical procedure, that requires you to take a vaccine against your will, or requires that upon your kids or your family without your will, without your agreement, is unconstitutional, period, full stop. And we're going to fight that at every level of government, because it is no role for the federal government or the state government or local governments to command you to do medical procedures to yourself or to your family. And drop the mic and walk off. So we're going to develop into that with this exciting panel that I have here today. I'm going to take a moment to just introduce our panelists and then let them kind of explain how they fit things here in, and then we'll go from there. Of course, we always leave time for questions at the end, so if there's anything that's on your heart or mind that you want to address to the panel, please, of course, always make sure to frame your comments in the form of a question so we can get to as many as possible and to continue that discussion. But starting from my furthest right and coming over, I'm thrilled to welcome Kyle Lamb to his first policy orientation. Kyle works for Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who y'all remember was with us here last year at Policy Orientation, where he is a government analyst for the communications team for the governor. And what Kyle does is he specializes in data analysis and research for Governor DeSantis on a variety of topics, including COVID-19, healthcare, elections, immigration, and other types of bill proposals. Kyle goes out and finds the facts and puts those in the proper context. Prior to that, I understand, Kyle, that you were a freelance writer and researcher and podcaster and journalist, and we're thrilled to have you. Thanks for making the trip.
Yep. Thanks for having me.
To Kyle's left is my good friend Ryan Bangert. Ryan is serves as Senior Counsel and Vice President for Legal Strategy at the Alliance Defending Freedom. He was also the Deputy First Attorney General for the Texas Attorney General's Office, and prior to that served in the Missouri Attorney General's Office with then General Josh Hawley. Ryan's been, an active litigant, leader in the conservative movement, a fierce fighter for liberty with ADF. And Ryan, welcome. Thanks for joining us. And then with us as well is my friend Rick Burnett. Rick is the Vice President of Burnett Specialists in Houston. It's one of our clients in the vax mandate case, one of the champions for liberty that stood up and helped us in fighting these vax mandates. Rick's background is a degree in business from Baylor University. Jealous of y'all's basketball program right now, I have to say. And his expertise lies in large contract negotiation, vendor consolidation, and overseeing the thousands of employees that they have, and that business, running that business, providing jobs and opportunities for thousands of Texans. So, Rick, thanks for joining us. So I want to start in kind of now letting our panelists introduce themselves to y'all in terms of how they fit in and kind of a little bit of a background. So let's go the other way. And, Rick, if you'll just give a brief introduction with yourself, your business, and how kind of you fit into our discussion here today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I've been in staffing for 40 years now. We're based out of Houston. We've got 10 offices in the state of Texas. So we're all Texas-based. We're privately held. We are 100% ESOP. Our contractors last year, we worked about 7,000 contractors in the state of Texas. Our contractors also get to participate in ESOP, so we have a great benefit program for them. And we're also certified woman-owned business. How we got involved in this really goes back several years ago, and I want to first off thank Rob and the association for being the heavy lifters in the fight. I was called by one of my colleagues about the Austin mandate for mandatory sick pay and asked if I would get involved with that and put my name on the target list and have to fight against all that. And that's where we first met with Rob, and actually went and listened to the hearings and sat with him and did an incredible job. So when we were asked to take on this last project, because we did Austin, we did San Antonio, and we did Dallas, because we stepped up to play, and we played hard. But again, we thank you and your association for making it happen for us.
Thank you, Rick. Ryan, tell us how you kind of fit into the picture of our discussion here today, and also a little bit more about what Alliance Defending Freedom is.
Certainly, Rob. And well, first off, let me say it's a real privilege to be here with these warriors for freedom. And you're not going to find a truer friend of freedom or limited government than Rob Henneke, who he could easily be sitting, he should be sitting in this middle chair today. He is really a tremendous leader, thought leader, and action leader in the conservative movement. So it's really a privilege that he asked me to be here. So ADF was involved in this litigation alongside TPPF and a number of other organizations, in that we brought suit as soon as the OSHA mandate was issued. So the mandate was issued in early November. The very next day, we filed a lawsuit. In fact, that very same day, we filed one lawsuit, and then several the next day, representing a number of clients, some of whom were religious education institutions, Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, Asbury Seminary. We represented a number of private Christian schools in Florida, Christian Employers Alliance, Homeschool Legal Defense Association. We also represented a Catholic school in the Dakotas, and we represented Bent Key Productions, otherwise known as the Daily Wire, in Nashville. So we brought a host of different challenges in a number of different circuits, but all of them had the same real thrust, which was this mandate, as Rob alluded to earlier, is unconstitutional. It's beyond the authority of the agency that issued it, and moreover, it violates separation of powers, both horizontal and vertical separation of powers. And we brought those lawsuits in a number of different circuits. These had to be brought in the circuit courts because of the statute that was at play, the ETS statute. And they were all consolidated in Cincinnati in the Sixth Circuit, and ultimately those rolled up to the U.S. Supreme Court. But we were involved in this, just like TPPF, every step of the way, actively litigating on behalf of our clients. And I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more later about how that played out and how the court treated those challenges. But that's how we were involved. And then the ADF, we've been around for about 30 years, and our focus is on religious freedom, parental rights, education, as well as rights of conscience. And so if you think about ADF, think Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop, think 303 Creative, think Barronelle Stutzman and Arlene Flowers. These are all cases that we worked on throughout the years.
Thank you, Ryan. And Kyle, you hail from the second conservative state in the United States, that other red state just across the pond. But we're thrilled to have you. We were big fans, of course, of Governor DeSantis, and that y'all work with us. But tell us a little bit about your specific role with the governor's office and how you fit into our discussion today.
Well, first of all, I'm happy to report that we're growing more conservative by the day. Republican registrations in Florida, I think, are outpacing Democrat registrations by 4 to 1 over the past several months. So people are flocking to Florida for freedom, so that's a great thing. I think what Governor DeSantis is doing in Florida very much represents what the Texas Public Policy Foundation and everybody here today is trying to do. We've taken a policy that really embodies the spirit of we think vaccine mandates are wrong and immoral. And we have shown that with legislation that has not only banned vaccine passports in Florida, banned government mandates. We're fighting back against OSHA, CMS, all of those mandates put forth by the federal government. We actually took it a step further, and I know that's not the scope of what we're discussing today, but we also banned private mandates in Florida. And the reason we did that, I think, is just to kind of explain what the governor's position is we feel like, this has been something we've been living with for 2 years now, and certainly there is a concern. The virus is obviously very destructive, but a lot of people have been showing up at their jobs for 2 years, and it's like, the governor's position is like, you can't, put them, say that their health has been at risk for 2 years and then working hard to keep a business open, and then all of a sudden we have a vaccine and say, no, you're too much of a liability after 2 years. So that's obviously not the scope of what we're talking about, but we do believe that vaccine mandates by the government are immoral, and we're really fighting hard, and we feel like we've embodied that position with our actions and the way it's worked so far.
Terrific. Thank you. And gentlemen, welcome. Again, thanks for joining us. Ryan, I'm going to ask you to start off. Last week was our shared incredible victory at the U.S. Supreme Court, working with the massive national coalition that got together over 26 state attorney generals, including the Texas AG, a number of other groups, and, not to steal your thunder, but we won. But tell us how. Tell us what that means, and really kind of looking forward, what you see as the next challenges. Kind of explain for us what happened last week.
Absolutely. And it was a fantastic victory, at least on the OSHA mandate side, and I think it's going to reverberate throughout the law. But the real lesson here is beware the ill-advised retweet. That was Ron Klain, the chief of staff for President Biden. But we'll get to that in just a moment. So this really all started, I think, before President Biden announced these mandates back in September. It really started when the CDC announced an eviction moratorium on evictions for private landowners. And that was challenged, and I believe TPPF was involved in some of those challenges. That was challenged, went to the U.S. Supreme Court. In the Alabama Association of Realtors case, the court said, CDC, you're the Center for Disease Control. Why are you messing around with property rights and landlord-tenant relationships? Where in your statute does it say you can impose an eviction moratorium? This goes beyond your statutory authority. And we know that for a couple of reasons. Because imposing an eviction moratorium all across the country, that's a big deal. That's a major question. And that's a term of art at the Supreme Court now, a major question. There's a doctrine called the Major Questions Doctrine. And the court basically applies that when an agency of the federal government extends its power far beyond the plain text of its statute that empowers it to act. And the court will ask, are you addressing a major question? Because if you are, you better have a pretty darn clear textual authority to do that. And based on that doctrine and a couple of other things we'll talk about, the court said, no, you can't impose this moratorium. That decision came down in August. Cue the vaccine fight in September. September 9th, President Biden takes the stage, and he says a couple of unique things, and I wanted to quote a few of those here because they're worth saying. He said, many of us are frustrated with the nearly 80 million Americans who are still not vaccinated, even though the vaccine is safe, effective, and free. He said, this is not about freedom or personal choice. Let that sink in for a second. The President of the United States takes the podium. This is not about freedom or personal choice. It's about protecting yourself and those around you, the people you work with, you care about, and you love. And finally, we've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin, and your refusal has cost us all. And then immediately afterwards, he says, we're going to announce vaccine mandates all across the board. OSHA applies a mandate to private employers of 100 or more employees, requiring them to force those employees on pain of termination to be vaccinated or alternatively to be tested every week and masked at their own cost. CMS, Center for Medicaid Services, required to force all recipients of CMS funds, Medicare and Medicaid, which is basically everyone in the healthcare industry, to receive vaccines or be fired. But not just that, every federal contractor, because he issues an executive order, 14042, that same day saying every federal contractor, if your employees work on this contract or if they come into contact with someone who works in the contract, everyone, and their employee, have to be vaccinated. And every federal worker, by the way, has to be vaccinated. So that's what started this fight. And as soon as OSHA and CMS issued their rules in November, the game was on. Pretty much every conservative group who values freedom in the country got involved in this fight and sued. And we sued under a couple of theories, and they were pretty much uniform throughout. Number one, we questioned whether the U.S. Constitution empowers these agencies to take this kind of action. OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, does the Commerce Clause really allow you to force Americans to participate in commerce by receiving a vaccination into your body? Does your statute, which empowers you to manage workplace safety, empower you to force 84 million Americans to receive a vaccine that's going to stay with them when they leave the workplace, when they go home, when they go to church, when they go shopping? CMS, does your statutory authority authorize you to do the same thing with healthcare workers? All of these questions were teed up. And they were teed up first in the Fifth Circuit, and I have to give this man over here some great credit, and this man too. They struck first blood. They actually, within 2 days after filing suit, the Fifth Circuit stayed the application of the OSHA mandate. So tremendous win. There may or may not have been some football spiking on text messages going back and forth. But we were in the Sixth Circuit on behalf of Daily Wire, the Eighth Circuit, and the 11th Circuit. Now, all of these cases were consolidated in the Sixth Circuit by a random lottery, and that stay traveled with all of those cases to the Sixth Circuit. We immediately asked the Sixth Circuit to hear the case en banc, the entire Sixth Circuit, because we believed we had a better shot of the full circuit giving us a good opinion. They denied that request by an 8-to-8 vote. Chief Judge Sutton, who's a real patriot and I believe one of our best judges, issued a dissent from that denial. And basically he said, look, this mandate is unlawful for a variety of reasons. One, the mandate forces 84 million Americans, the OSHA mandate, 84 million Americans to get vaccinated. That's a big deal. That's a major question. And I'm looking at OSHA's statute. There's nothing in there that talks about vaccination of all Americans everywhere or all workers. He said also, there's this thing called the non-delegation doctrine. So if OSHA says our statute is really vague, it's really general, it's really broad, somewhere in there we can find this authority. And he said, well, no, if you go that direction, you run into this thing called the non-delegation doctrine, which says if you're going to exercise power like this, you can't do so under a general grant of authority from Congress. Congress can't take its lawmaking power and hand it over to an agency, say, go for it. They have to provide some limiting principles. And lastly, he said, well, the agency's never done anything like this before, so from a practical perspective, this looks like it's illegal. Notwithstanding Judge Sutton's excellent analysis, 3 judges, actually 2 in a dissent on the Sixth Circuit, they vacated the stay that Rob and Rick worked so hard to get. So yes, mea culpa, maybe the Sixth Circuit wasn't the best place after all, but we all go up to the U.S. Supreme Court. They hear argument on the 7th of January and issue their opinion on the 13th. And what an opinion it was, 6-3. 6-3 per curiam, which means it was an opinion of the full court, no one authored it. But they said a number of different things. They said, first off, we don't think OSHA's statute empowers it to do what it did. And then in the concurrence, Justice Gorsuch, joined by Justice Thomas and Alito, went even further. And he said, we think the non-delegation doctrine also prohibits this. In fact, we even question whether the Constitution gives them authority to do this. And so I think what you see from the conservative majority on the court in that case are a couple of things. One, they're doing what we hope they would do. They are constraining and limiting the power of the administrative state. That was one of the key things during the Trump administration that was sought for in judges who were appointed to the bench, not just at the Supreme Court, but all the appellate courts. Judges who would question extensive, expansive uses of administrative, bureaucratic authority. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court did in this case. And they did it by applying principles of law that protect both the horizontal and vertical separation of powers. Horizontal, meaning the separation of powers between Congress, the courts, and the executive branch. And vertical, of course, the states and the federal government. Because one of the key things that was pointed to by the per curiam opinion, but also by Justice Gorsuch, was if you're going to displace authority that belongs to the state, because states have something called the police power, the power to regulate for health, safety, and welfare of their citizens. The federal government doesn't have that power. They have enumerated powers in the Constitution. And that's something that's often lost on bureaucratic rule makers in Washington, D.C. who think they can sit down and control the entire economy with the stroke of a pen. But the court said, if you're going to displace traditional state powers, there needs to be a clear statement in the law of preemption. And we don't have that here. We're going to hold you to account, federal bureaucracy. We're going to hold you to account. We're going to interpret this statute to constrain your powers, not to expand them, like has been frequently done under the Chevron doctrine. So I think what we've seen now from the court in this opinion is a roadmap for constraining abuses and overextensions of federal administrative power, that we can roll this forward. And we're hopeful there's some cases on the docket later this term where this can be road tested involving the EPA. So I think that we've got a roadmap for constraining federal power. But we also have a cautionary note, and I'll end with this. The CMS case, 5-4, went the other way. Now, why did that happen? I mean, really, if you look at the textual analysis, it was a little closer call, but it should have come out the same way. And we had 4 votes saying it should have come out the other way. I think what happened there was, I think you see the court reaching for a result. And I think that the court reached for a result because most of the infections and deaths from COVID have happened in the context of long-term care facilities, far out of proportion to the population. And I think the court did not want to let go of CMS's power to regulate in that context. So that's my own personal opinion. That's not sort of, that's just coming from my own view of what happened. But I think that you saw a bit of a results-oriented ruling there. But the upshot is we now have a court that is willing to aggressively apply doctrines of legal interpretation, textualism, separation of powers, major questions doctrine, non-delegation, all of these things the conservative legal movement has been talking about and dreaming about for years and even decades. We've now seen the court apply them. And we've seen the court apply those doctrines in a way that meaningfully limits federal power on a big issue. And that's a very heartening sign, I think, for those of us who care about liberty and separation of powers.
That's great. Well said. Thank you, Ryan. So shifting focus a little bit, and those of you who've joined us before know that part of what I do at the foundation is I run our public interest litigation center. We bring the same kind of cases. We represent individuals and businesses in fighting unlawful and unconstitutional government action. And I'll share with you that one of the most difficult things about my job is having clients who are willing to be represented by TPPF on a pro bono basis to fight these. I meet with a business owner, I meet with an individual, and they're harmed and they're mad and they've got great standing and great injury, and I say, all right, let's sign you up, and they're like, I hope you find somebody else. Because it is a big deal putting your name, putting your business, putting everything you've worked for on a lawsuit against the government, especially at times when there might be somebody else to pick that fight and you don't have to. And so I recognize, I deeply appreciate just the investment, the risks, the personal publicity and what our clients put at stake when they agree to partner with the foundation to take on these fights. But because I can't do what I do without Rick agreeing to step up and be one of the named parties in this case and to be on record and so forth. So, Rick, I wanted to ask you from, and thank you for being a patriot and doing this, but, not just from, I guess, the conservative and the liberty perspective, talk to us a little bit also about kind of your business decision-making and how you agreed to be part of this fight and really what this vaccine mandate, threatened your business with. We had Ryan just now at the 30,000-foot level. Bring us down to the 10-foot level and tell us from your business perspective what this threat looked like and why y'all agreed to be our client in this case.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting because, again, we're a small business here in Texas, or a medium-sized business here in Texas. And when we were first approached for the city of Austin one, I thought it was, this is too good to be true. Somebody's going to do this pro bono, and we need to put our name on it. I've served on the board of directors for our state association for many years, and so we had several partners that were good friends of mine that are owners of the companies and that were approached, and we sat down and talked about it, and we kept going, well, I'll put my name on it if you put your name on it, and you're like going, well, I'll put your name on it, going back and forth. And so finally we just said, we got to step up because too many people are sitting on the bench. And especially in our industry, staffing industry, there's a lot of staffing firms in the state of Texas. And we're constantly always asking for PAC contributions and stepping up and going down and fighting these situations. And only a handful of people ever show up. And it's pretty typical. But you don't make change unless you get out of your seat and you get in the game. So we decided to step up into the game. Our first experience, obviously, with Rob and his team was the city of Austin. That was a little bit more intense because it was personal. They had the opposing people, picketing and fighting, and I was like going, what are we walking into at the beginning of this? But Debbie D'Ambrosio, who's our vice president risk manager, she'll tell you, she said she had sleepless nights just thinking about, putting your name on this document and having a target, so to speak. And you really don't know what you're going to be do other than, I got to go fight. I can't sit back and let this happen. And the city of Austin situation was one, and this one, the mandatory vax was one, where you didn't have months to think about it. It was like, let's do it, go. And when we got the call to step up on this one, it was a no-brainer because the city of Austin one was one we had to think about, because we didn't know anything about it, but once we got engaged there, we just said, let's do it. So we stepped up, and again, Rob and his team, the heavy lifters that pushed it on. But the impact, this is what's a crazy thing about, to me, is when I sit and I'm on the legislative committee for the association, I go and listen to all the policies that are being presented, and I'm going, who created these things? Think about it, have you ever run a business? We worked about 4,600 contractors in the state of Texas last year. Any given week, we probably have 700 to 750 contractors. And that's different people coming and going. So when we had countless number of hours for our team with Jessica and Paige, who are our directors and our training manager, trying to create, how do we track this? How do we do it? How do we change our software to upload the information on a weekly basis from our workforce to make this happen? And then Debbie spent all of last week trying to get ready to this communication, and this thing happened at the last minute. And I'm sure she went through several rolls of Tums, to try to get this done, because we had to get this information out to our employees, and we had to get it out to them by law. And then you start looking at, as a business owner, well, if I don't do it, it's a $14,000 fee for every person I don't do. And the thing I thought was interesting is that we had already basically have been doing the things we thought was right for our employees. I don't think I have the right to mandate to employees. I certainly would encourage them. The vaccine has certainly helped. It hadn't stopped it. Masks maybe have helped. They haven't stopped it. So these are things that we're dealing with as a society, not just in the business sector. But it's not my job to mandate to anybody. But we encourage them, and we try to do everything we can, and our clients do the same thing. But as we were going into this before COVID, we were already going into a tight labor market. And then COVID hit, and then all crazy went loose, right? And then you had the government with extended unemployment benefits where I had jobs, but people wouldn't go to work because they were getting paid more to stay home. And so clients were going, I need help. And I said, well, I couldn't get it. So we were working 4 times harder to help our clients' needs because of that situation. And then you come into it now, the flexible workforce, where candidates are going, well, I don't want to go to unless they have a flexible workforce, so then the labor market's even tighter. And then you throw out this question about, okay, now you're going to have a mandate vax, and you're going to have to be tested if you don't. And oh, by the way, there's no test in the market, so go figure it out yourself. And you're going to have to pay for it, and you're going to have to wear a mask if you don't. So at the end of the day, we stepped up to fight. And when you look at it going, can a small company like us make a difference? We can with others. Certainly we can with people like Rob and his association who are fighting for the business rights and for our employee rights. But at the end of the day, when the announcement was made on Friday, we all just said that was like Christmas all over for us. Because we didn't have to, frantically worry about how we're going to get this done. And, you know, the question is about, when they think about these policies, about how are companies supposed to implement these things? And going back to the Austin mandate, and because that was funny, because I was there, and Kelly Hudson was on a stand, and the opposition was asking him, well, can't you just track this easily? And Kelly said, no, I got one person working in Round Rock one day, one person working in Austin the next day, and they're traveling. I can't keep up with when they're only working in Austin County. And he goes, well, why don't you just have a list and just put a little tick mark by their name every time they work there? And I laughed, and the judge kind of pointed out at me, he said, you know, but I'm going, I can't believe it. You know, at the end of the day, they're coming up with this insanity, like going, oh, this is real simple to track. It's not. It's very, very complicated, especially in the staffing industry when you have a flexible workforce that comes and goes.
Thank you, Rick. So, Kyle, asking you, you know, in looking at the data, the statute that the Biden administration used to justify or to implement this vaccine mandate was an emergency temporary standard through OSHA. And the criteria under the ETS statute purportedly allows, and this was the argument by the Biden administration, to implement these workplace safety regulations on an emergency basis when there exists a grave danger. And that was a big focus of a lot of the litigation, was the grave danger aspect of it. But frame for us today, a week after the Supreme Court ruling, what the data tells you about kind of where things stand now with COVID and the pandemic, and, you know, put into context what you're seeing in terms of trends and the facts that exist today.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the grave danger. They really have been pushing that as the basis because that's the only way they could justify it, you know, legally. But what's really interesting is in their own language. I resort back to the ETS of healthcare workers in June. The funny thing is, in the ETS in June that they issued for CMS, they acknowledge that vaccine status alone is not going to eliminate the danger. So they basically acknowledge that their own rationale for this is not really effective. And when you look at the data, it's just, vaccination, look, you can absolutely believe, and I do, and we do in Florida, we believe that the vaccinations are definitely decreasing severe risk. I don't think anybody is going to disagree with that. I think in UK, I think the best surveillance we have for vaccination is that deaths are anywhere from 6 to 10 times lower in fully vaccinated people than unvaccinated people. So it definitely does decrease risk. But I think what we saw very early on in the summer is that we're just not seeing serializing immunity with this virus because of vaccines. And that is the justification that the federal government has used. I think if you look at their ETS for OSHA, 500 times they mention the word transmission. So it's obviously a very, very big key to they're trying to decrease transmission. They want to get rid of COVID. And unfortunately, the virus is just not being stopped. In Florida, I can tell you with this Omicron wave in December, you should see, if vaccinations were helping, you'd like to see some correlation. I know correlation does not necessarily equal causation, but you would like to see some evidence that maybe the vaccines are stopping transmission. Well, in Florida, you should have seen an inverse correlation from county to county of vaccines to spread, right? But instead, we actually saw a positive correlation of like 0.5, which means that it's actually the inverse is true, where there is more spread in counties that have more vaccinated people. And I think we're seeing that, all across the country right now. States that have vaccine passports and mandates right now, California, New York, Hawaii, are seeing huge case numbers. I'll use Texas and Nebraska and Florida as examples. Actually have, on average, lower rates with similar population than California and New York and Hawaii. And so I think we're just seeing that vaccinations definitely decrease spread, or definitely decrease risk, but they're not stopping spread. And so when we look at this, the evidence is just against any policy that is based on trying to eliminate the virus. It's just not happening right now.
Let me stay with you for a second, Kyle, and ask, as you've been studying the data and you've been following this, you mentioned that states, conservative states like Texas and Florida, have some of the best statistics right now. And some of the most strict states, New York, Hawaii are two examples, have had some of the highest surges. Is there any real connection? Is this random, or, I mean, is it the fact that we're in the South and it's just warmer here and it's nicer weather that is a contributing thing, and that these government policies are really not having an effect on it? Or are you seeing that there are the lockdown policies of the more blue states that are making it worse? And trying to just kind of unpack the comparison between red and blue states, whether that just is geography and climate, or if you've seen that what Governor DeSantis and Governor Abbott have been doing has been leading to the better results here.
Yeah, absolutely. Governor DeSantis has said all along, he believes there's definitely, like with this virus specifically, there's definitely a seasonal component to it. And I think we've seen that. The summer wave, Texas and Florida, we've both seen summer of 2020, summer of 2021. Obviously, we saw a lot more cases than, say, in the spring and fall, and then in the winter it goes up a little bit. We've seen that seasonal pattern, and I think Governor DeSantis has said all along that, look, the problem is we're not seeing results with some of these lockdown policies. It's just not stopping the results. In Florida, we're not saying we're better off because we did not implement the non-pharmaceutical interventions like masking mandates and such. We're not better off because of it, but we're not worse off in spite of it. And that's what we're saying, is that we think the NPIs have not really helped. They've not been effective. So why put forth these disastrous lockdown policies, other things that are going to cause side harms like businesses shutting down, people losing jobs. We're seeing it in healthcare right now, 5% staffing across the country, less than what we saw in January of 2021 right now, because of people losing their jobs. There are a few nurses. You've got California, Wisconsin, New York calling in the National Guard, to help with bed shortages right now. And in California specifically, this is how ridiculous it is. They're actually calling back COVID-positive nurses to assist with patients because of the staffing shortage that they caused by vaccine mandates. So these people that are unvaccinated, in many cases, have already had COVID over the past year, that have been working for 2 years. They're too much of a risk to bring back to work, but COVID-positive nurses can come back and work in hospitals. It's complete insanity, and I think we're trying in Florida. Governor DeSantis has made it a point to say, look, we think that all of these policies cause additional harms that we're not taking into account, and we're not really saving lives by instituting the policies with COVID. So that's the approach that we've taken in Florida.
That's great. Thank you. Rick, let me ask you, one of the things that was unique about the approach by this administration, maybe recognizing that they didn't have an argument to just do a direct individual mandate. And, the workaround was to say, okay, we're going to implement a workaround. Ryan, you mentioned that. It was tweeted out by the White House Chief of Staff that this was their workaround to get to a vaccine mandate. But the effect was, on 80 million Americans who are in the workforce, using the employer as the enforcement mechanism. And, I know, Rick, your business and your employees, they're your family. From your business perspective, what kind of position does that put you in when now, under the risk of significant fines to your business and your livelihood and the threat of those fines, you're being put in a position to basically implement the policy of the federal government? I think it was famously said, when you're in a robbery and someone says your money or your life, it's not really a choice. And you guys were in an unfair situation, but tell us about how that interaction and your reaction to what that puts you in terms of the posture of your employees and what that was like as a business perspective.
Well, I was still waiting for the paycheck from the government to how I was going to pay for the administrative overhead that it was going to take to do this job. Again, our job is kind of changing one person's life at a time by helping them find a job, not be caught up in all the administrative work. I don't want to be a cop for the government. And the thing Debbie and I talked about, I said, I think one of the biggest, if this thing passed, I think one of the biggest things you're going to see in the black market is falsification of documentation. I said, how am I supposed to prove that this document you uploaded is accurate or not? but I have to have administrative duties to do that, and every single week, the falsification of your test results, whether they're negative or positive, and was that document real? Am I going to have to, watch that as well? So it's just, it's crazy from that standpoint. Now, we do have clients that request that a person is vaccinated. And I said, okay, so I'm screening candidates for that client. The client said, our policy is that we want people vaccinated or they're going to have to test. And I'm going, that's the customer's responsibility. That's what they're doing it. And I tell our candidates, if you're interested, here's an opportunity, but they are requiring it. If not, I'll find you another job. But not, I can't work with you at all unless you do this. So we do that every single day based on our clients' needs and their requests. And so I think for a customer, for an employer to make their own judgments of what's best and right, that's okay. But when it comes down to mandatory of saying this or this, it's a little difficult to swallow. And as I shared with you, and we just talked about it on the tight labor market, we had one employee that left, and it wasn't the only reason, but she said one of the reasons she left because she felt like we were going to have to be mandated, so she went to a smaller company. But it was a different reason why but that was one of the reasons she threw out to us when she left. So they had people obviously worrying about their jobs because they did not want to be, mandated from that standpoint. So at the end of the day, the government is using businesses as a vehicle to do their work. But the crazy thing about this is the tracking and the penalties of assessing $14,000. Who the hell came up with that? From a number standpoint, and then who's going to track it, how they're going to track it, and how's that going to be it's just, but they just pushed it down. So here, it's all yours. Good luck.
Ryan, I want to ask you, so when last Friday I had the chance to be on with Sean Hannity on his radio show and ask my takeaway, and my reaction to the Supreme Court decision in some ways, this is what I told him, was we kind of missed the forest for the trees. Yes, we won, and you're correct to your point that the concurring opinion did address some of these constitutional questions. But the majority opinion was a very limited textual reading of the statute. And it was very laser focused on the words in this statute do not say what you say they do, and so therefore you can't do it. Do you agree with my assessment that the court kind of miffed on the bigger issues? Have you seen that as a characteristic of this court? And what do you think it's going to take to have now a full majority of the Supreme Court address these constitutional questions, and what does it look like if they don't?
So some great questions in there, and clearly the per curiam, which was the majority opinion, was not willing to go as far as Gorsuch and the concurrence was willing to go. And what I mean by that is there's a big question that was posed, and that is, does the Constitution even empower an agency like OSHA to do what it did? Does the Commerce Clause, which is the operative provision of the Constitution from which OSHA draws its power, does it give that agency the power to force Americans to engage in commerce? And that question was completely ignored by the per curiam. It wasn't even addressed. Likewise, the per curiam really didn't touch on this question of whether the ETS, the emergency temporary standard, was properly issued. So they just really drilled down in on, does the statutory authority that OSHA has give it the power to issue a blanket nationwide mandate? And the answer to that was no, but then the court pulled back and said, well, but maybe there are some such circumstances, like places that you can demonstrate have higher transmission rates because workers are close together, like meat packing plants, or research labs where viruses are being studied. Maybe then OSHA. So they did leave that door open for OSHA to regulate. But I think you're right in that we do miss the forest for the trees, but someone who didn't miss it was Gorsuch, when he wrote right at the beginning of his opinion, the question of this case is who decides? Who decides? This case was ultimately not about the wisdom or efficacy of a vaccine. And we certainly never posed that question in our litigation because that's a question for debate. Many people have benefited from the vaccines, clearly. But that wasn't the question of the case. It was a question of power. was a question of the exercise of power. And ultimately, that question was, does an administrative agency, staffed with unelected bureaucrats who are removed from the people who are being regulated, have the power to issue in one document a requirement that will affect 84 million American workers, including employers like Rick? Does that power reside in the hands of unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C.? And that is a question that is absolutely crucial to answer. And the per curiam said it in one way, but in much more so in the concurrence. The answer is no. The people's elected representatives ultimately would have that power, maybe, if the Commerce Clause gives it to them. And we're going to elide that question for now. But if anyone has the power, it would be them, and maybe not even them. Maybe it belongs to the states. And that's probably where it properly belongs, is in the states and in the hands of individual business owners. And so ultimately, the question in this case was the question about the distribution of government power and where that kind of power resides on major questions affecting just about every American. Because if you're not a worker, you're probably married to a worker, you have a parent who's a worker, or you're dependent upon a worker. So every American was affected by this policy. And is that the kind of thing that we want unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. to have free reign? And the answer to that should be no, but the per curiam, it didn't quite get there, as you pointed out. It didn't quite get there. It left the door open. And so there's a lot more work left to do. But this is ultimately a question about who decides and the devolution of power. And this is the wisdom of the Constitution. Who should make these decisions? The people closest to those affected by those decisions. Rule by experts is not exactly a very good thing. And I think you saw this in the Supreme Court's, the division between the dissenters, Kagan, Breyer, and Sotomayor, and the majority. When the dissenters complained and they said, this is a question about who decides, but it's a question about whether the court should be stripping the experts of their prerogative to decide these questions for the American people. That's really the question in the minds of the dissenters. The question in the minds of liberal justices was, should a majority of conservative justices on a court strip these experts who have the knowledge and wisdom to make these rules of their rightful power to do so? Whereas in the majority, their view was, should we be stripping the people's representatives, or more properly, states, the governors, of their power to regulate closer to home? Because they are the ones who are most closely in touch with those who are affected. So that was the question that didn't really get answered in this opinion.
In just a minute, as we conclude our panel discussion, we're going to open it up to questions from y'all. So we'll have one of our TPPF team members walking around with a microphone. And because we're live streaming this, if you'll wait, raise your hand if you'll wait to get the microphone so that everyone can hear your question. We'll turn it into now including y'all in the panel. But Kyle, I want to come to you for kind of your thoughts based on the data that you've reviewed and kind of addressing this question. And I'll preview it by sharing some very confidential information with y'all and the thousands of people that are watching live. In terms of TPPF's, HR policies on this, our super secret COVID policies, which is, if you don't feel good, stay home. And when you feel better, come back. And you guys would be amazed to know that our policy for the flu, for the cold, for other illnesses is very similar to that. And I'm not making light of anything, but but that's always been that. That's where we've been. That's how we've addressed it. That's where I think that most people in business and schools and whatnot are today. That's not where we were 2 years ago. And if you look at 2 years ago, where we crashed the economy, closed businesses, non-essential workers, shutdown orders, lockdown orders, all of this, Kyle, today, 2 years ago, we just kind of addressed this with the same, if you don't feel good, stay home type approach. And we didn't have the government get involved in everything. How would today look different? Would it? And kind of what is your, looking back, opinion about all of these government actions that were taken that now have seemingly been abandoned for just the common sense advice of stay home if you're sick?
I think we have completely lost the concept of risk assessment in the last 2 years. Using kids for an example, if you look at the CDC flu rates, right, you look at estimated disease burden of the flu for children in a given flu season, all of the last 10 years, with the one exception, had a higher rate of mortality among estimated symptomatic illnesses that occurred in that flu season than what we have experienced with COVID right now. The fact is, children are safer right now from COVID than the flu. That's not to say that every single child is safe from COVID, but it is not a high risk for most kids. And yet, schools across the country, fortunately not here in Texas and not in Florida, but schools across the country are still shutting down because of healthy quarantine, positive tests, where kids show up either with the sniffles or not sick at all, but they're close to a close contact that had COVID, so they have to go home, and schools are just shutting down now because of it. Well, in UK, they did a study, the government did a study on this. 99% of all kids that was a close contact to another positive test did not end up getting COVID. So it turns out they realized, hey, we're sending these kids home when 99% of them, even though they're close to a contact with somebody with COVID, doesn't end up getting sick. So it's like, what's the point? This is a terrible policy. And I think we have lost our ability to look at the data here in the United States and take that assessment of risk. I mean, I can tell you, if you look at CDC mortality rates, 85 and over are almost 8,000 times more likely to die of COVID than ages 0 to 4. 8,000 times more likely. And that's based on population rates. So I think we just have to look at this. We know who's affected by COVID the most. We know people with higher risk, such as heart disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension. We know age groups that are higher risk. I think we just need to get back to looking at what the data says, looking at who's most at risk, try to protect those people. And I'm proud that Governor DeSantis in Florida has taken a focused protection. You know, he put seniors first, even though for some reason the CDC did not advise that seniors get vaccinated first when vaccinations started rolling out in December 2020. Governor DeSantis looked at the data and said, no, this is crazy. 80% of the deaths are 65 and over. We're going to make that a priority and vaccinate those people first. And I think we just need to get back to that common sense approach.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, let's hear what y'all have to say. This has been a great discussion, but I want to include you. I have a question, this gentleman down here. And as brief as y'all can keep your questions, so we can get to everybody. I'd appreciate it. But
Hi. Hi, I'm John Scott. I'm an anesthesiologist in Dallas-Fort Worth area. Appreciate all your comments. The main thing is, if this was polio, there'd be no questions. Polio happened, we worked on a cure, got it. But with the way the vaccines are, you don't know if you're good or not. I do agree with what you said, Kyle, about the people that have the comorbidities are the ones that need it. Other people, what about the ones that have had the vaccinations and still die from COVID? So there is no perfect vaccine for it now. What bothers me, and I'd like to hear you guys talk on it, but you didn't bring it up, is hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin. To me, that is just as reliable as all your data on the vaccines. So I appreciate that.
Kyle, have you looked at that?
I'll take that. The treatment thing is, I think, a great point, because that's, I mean, if you look at some of the pillars of why vaccine mandates are appropriate, you know, is there a grave danger from the disease? Are vaccines safe and effective? Is there a superior alternative? Is it superior to the alternatives? And I would argue that's a big one right there. We have treatment now. We have, we have monoclonal antibodies, which we rolled out in Florida in August. They're doing very well. Regeneron, I think against Delta, was about 80% effective against hospitalization. We have GSK is a new one, which is also called sotrovimab. It's doing very well against Omicron, which is more mild to begin with, so there are fewer people being hospitalized for that. And I think that's a great point. I think now we have a new antiviral pill coming out from Pfizer, and that so far, I know the trials are a little iffy, but so far they show great results. So I think that's another aspect that we need to look at. We do have great treatment options available, so it shouldn't just come down to putting all of our eggs in the vaccine basket. And you mentioned polio. Obviously, that's a big difference with the vaccine than what we have now, because vaccines that have been mandated with children in the past, we've had decades long of a safety trial, risk factors. We knew how well they were effective. We knew that they were providing sterilizing immunity. These are vaccines that have not been around very long. We don't know if there are long-term side effects, and I don't think there are, but we don't know for sure. So I think that is a little bit different in looking at this vaccine compared to past ones.
Great, thank you. Who's next? Down here, sir.
Hi, Vince Puente for Texas, small business owner. And I apologize, I went in the first part, so maybe you already covered this. 2 points. One, the federal government is mandating their employees. They are the largest employer of all employers in the United States. In a way, I would contend that they're not employers. It's our money. We're the ones that employ them, and I'm surprised that they can mandate that. I'm not surprised, but so that's one issue. Second issue is there was two decisions the Supreme Court made. And the second one, they agreed that the federal government could extend the mandate to anyone that received federal funds. Well, that's a lot of people. And does that mean if I win a federal bid, then I've got to go by the mandate? And so I've heard conservatives say, well, the Supreme Court ruled it right. I've heard other conservatives say, no, the Supreme Court did not rule that right. And I'd like y'all's intake on both those subjects.
Ryan, let me pitch that one to you.
Yeah, certainly. So you're right. The question is still out there as to whether or not the federal government can extend this power, extend the mandate to all federal contractors. Because one thing the Supreme Court didn't decide is whether the executive order that requires all federal contractors to impose vaccination requirements on their employees is lawful. Now that has been enjoined. That requirement has been enjoined by some of the lower courts as of right now. And that's a question that interprets the Federal Property Act. I think those courts got it right. I think if you look at the way the Supreme Court interpreted the OSHA statute and you apply that reasoning to the federal contractor mandate, we're not talking about healthcare providers now, we're talking about contractors outside the healthcare space. I think that the lower court's decisions were spot on. And they applied the very same reasoning that the U.S. Supreme Court did in the OSHA case and said, you do not have the power, the federal government does not have the power to require all these contractors under the spending clause to impose vaccination requirements. And healthcare separate? Healthcare is separate because it's governed under a separate statute. It's the receipt of Medicare and Medicaid funds. And so the court was interpreting HHS statutes and regulations applied by CMS. And I think getting back to the question, why was that different? Ultimately, I think my personal sense is it was a results-driven analysis. The court looked across the spectrum of people who were being affected and said, a lot of these infections are happening in long-term care facilities. And there was a specific statute that governed LTCs, not to get too far down in the weeds, that said that CMS could regulate for health and safety. And I think what that meant was they could govern things like sterilization of instruments and sterilization of facilities. That's what Justice Thomas said. But the court took that and expanded that and said, well, we think health and safety includes forcing sterilization of human beings by forcing them to get vaccines, basically. That's a stretch. I think that Justice Thomas called them out on that correctly, but they had 5 votes for that interpretation. But that's not going to govern in the context of federal contractors generally, because that's the Property Act. And that's a different statute that governs federal contracting generally. And there's nothing in there, nothing. If you read the decision by the Sixth Circuit, they absolutely take that mandate apart, and rightfully so.
I'll add to that, and I see this in a longer, direction moving forward. These questions are yet addressed. Look, I'm not one that goes and finds hidden meaning into the Constitution. I see the text of the Constitution, we interpret it based on the text and what that tells us. There is no constitutional amendment that says you have a constitutional right not to be vaccinated. But I think that there's a bigger issue that's not been addressed, and I don't think that we're looking at penumbras or going out of bounds to say that, in essence, many of the constitutional protections that exist is the United States Constitution protecting your right to be left alone. And it's unprecedented in the way that this government is seeking these ways to compel a federal worker, a federal contractor, a healthcare worker, an employee of a staffing company to take on a medical procedure. It's something that the court has been grappling with, I mean, for the entire history, but it makes me just think back to a decade ago when you had the Supreme Court argument over the Affordable Care Act and about the very concept about not whether you had to take a vaccine, but whether the federal government could just compel you to buy health insurance that you didn't want to. And there the court said, well, that's unconstitutional. They upheld it on other grounds. But, it was the discussion as part of that about, well, could the government compel you to eat broccoli? Or could the government, vaccines actually came up in that argument. And, so there is, I think, a bigger issue of case law and jurisprudence that still needs to be resolved that addresses the constitutional protections afforded to an individual's autonomy. And I do think that it exists. I don't think that it's ever been addressed in this way because the manner that it's been applied is unprecedented. But, you have your constitutional protections if you're a Navy SEAL, if you're a federal worker, if you're a federal contractor. I don't think your employment status should diminish the rights that you have under the Constitution. So we haven't gotten there, but these issues have not been resolved to some of Ryan's comments. And so I do see a future trajectory that we're going to have to get to a point to bring those areas to head to really address some of the individual liberty context that's been missed so far because of the context of these cases as they've been going forward.
Rob, one thing I'll mention on that is an excellent point. One of the issues that the Supreme Court docked that was raised in several of the petitions, including the ones that we filed on behalf of the seminaries, was a question of whether religious freedom protects those who have religious objections to receiving the vaccine, and whether they should be, and whether that doctrine of religious freedom, free exercise, has something to say in response to the vaccine mandate. We believe it does, but the Supreme Court did not take that question up, specifically avoided addressing that question, specifically in the context of religious employers and their employees. So that question was put to the Supreme Court, didn't address it. I know Professor at George Mason University,
Soman?
Not Soman, his name will come to me in a bit, but he challenged the vaccine mandate on the ground that he had natural immunity. And the university did not want to mess with him. But he raised his constitutional right to bodily integrity. And I think that was in CLA that brought that. And so you had some interesting theories that are being propounded here and there that just the courts have not been willing, or the litigants have not been willing to really flesh them out.
That's right. Who's next? Yes, ma'am. Clayton, can you get over here? Here.
So, former hospital worker. Former hospital worker, part of the Great Resignation. So, do you believe that the hospital workers were, and this is Ryan, potentially treated differently because we have accepted so many of these mandates in the past? For example, the Medicare and Medicaid already required the flu vaccine of 80%, something like that. So we had already given over to that. To get out of school, to get your internship, long list of things that you have to do. And by the way, they accepted my titers for that. I still have measles, mumps, and rubella titers 50 years later. But anyway, so do you think that was a part of it, that we'd never fought back on all these things they were injecting in us up until that point for medical workers? So they said, we can't lose that ground.
That's a great question. But it's Todd Zawicki was the name of the professor at George Mason. There was something in the per curiam opinion that really caught my eye, the majority in the CMS case. And they said, well, it's true that CMS has never imposed a federal mandate on healthcare workers to receive vaccines, but that's only because states have required it. And if states hadn't required it, of course CMS would have done it. And so they really used the fact that CMS has this cooperative relationship with the states, and the fact that states have imposed these requirements against the healthcare workers by saying, look, if states hadn't done it, of course the feds would have done it. But of course, that completely elides the question, right, of if the states hadn't done it, do the feds even have the power to do it? So it assumes the answer to the question. And the court ultimately said, well, of course the feds have the power to do this, because look at these statutes that empower CMS to hand out all this federal money. They require CMS to ensure that the federal money is economically and efficiently used. They require the feds have the power to ensure that these recipients of the federal funds operate healthy and safe workplaces in some cases. And they extrapolated from that. And I think also just the mere fact that COVID is being treated in these hospitals, it's being treated in these healthcare facilities. And in the OSHA case, you saw that mention we talked about earlier, where the per curiam majority said, well, maybe there are instances where COVID transmission is really likely to occur, like a lab where they're studying COVID, or places that have very, very dense populations of workers. What they didn't say, but what I think they were thinking was, and also in healthcare facilities, where you're going to necessarily come into contact with it. So I think you had two justices, Roberts and Kavanaugh, who were really sold on that idea. Well, that surely the feds have to have some power, some residual power to deal with this question. And that gets back to that big question of who decides. Does that power really reside at the federal level? And they just weren't willing to let that go.
Rick, I'm curious, real quick, if you've ever been able to quantify or look at the percentage cost to your business of complying with government requirements. I know that, for example, when the Affordable Care Act went into effect, that was a huge hit to business and the staffing industry. But if you, to the slow drip, to the slow, trickle of these and the progression over time, if you had to think about it, like what kind of impact or burden would you put that y'all have to deal with that just involves complying with what the government tells you to do?
Well, it's very difficult to put a deal, but it basically comes down to administrative overhead. We fairly run a lean ship, especially after COVID. Most of our administrative folks were let go. We kept all of our recruiters as essential to our clients, and so we have a very, very tight group right now. And so as things do come down and that overhead cost comes into play, it's got to add more and more administrative overhead costs. And then the question really comes down to who pays for it. The staffing industry is a very, very competitive market. A lot of clients we have contracts with, 2-3 year contracts with fixed markups. And to continue adding these additional burdens on and on and on into it, I mean, it's just crazy. The Obama healthcare was a great example. I mean, it hit everybody at that point. And again, how do you handle it? And the unknown of how many people are going to take the bronze level and all the different cost level. I mean, it's really managing the unknown. And we had to put a lot of money aside, and we still have money aside waiting there to figure out how many more cases we may have or how many more people might have the bronze plans. So from a management standpoint, you're managing the unknown. And that overhead cost and that how you're burning that into your numbers it's just like put a blindfold on and just good luck.
Yes, ma'am. And I think we'll have this question, one more.
This is for Kyle. Forgive me because I'm not familiar. Is it an executive order that prohibits private employer mandates in Florida?
No, it's actually special. We call it a special session, and it was the governor pushed for it, and fortunately we got overwhelming support in the legislature. So it's actually in law now. Now there are some opt-outs. Technically speaking, if a company would like to have a mandate, they must allow opt-outs for medical situations, pregnancy or expected pregnancy, prior immunity, or sincerely held beliefs. It doesn't have to be religious, just that you sincerely hold objection to a vaccine mandate. And if a person does not meet any one of those criteria, then they can opt out for a testing up to once a week or masking difference. But I think probably 99% of people would fall under one of those, I think. So.
And what is the enforcement mechanism there?
So we actually have a special, we actually have an email address through the Department of Health. We have an investigative arm that any employee can actually file a complaint if they feel like their rights are being violated, and then the state will investigate those complaints.
And that applies to healthcare workers.
Last question in the back, ma'am, right there with your hand up.
Hi, my name is Dr. Gina Dunkel. I'm a psychologist down in Galveston County. So this is about federal mandates. My husband, he was hit by an IED in Iraq. He's a Marine. He serves in law enforcement today for federal. And he's not able to have the vaccine. He's missing some organs. He's missing part of his leg. His doctor told him, don't do this because you're missing a kidney and a spleen and part of your pancreas. And so he has basically been threatened and told that he has to have this vaccine. And he was then told that you have to test every 72 hours, which then caused sleep apnea, which was very serious. And one of the things that was the most difficult for him that nobody has talked about really, because he's an anomaly, right? I recognize that most people are not dealing with the same thing that we're dealing with, because this is a true medical exemption that he's asking for, and he's not being given. But what is also true is that he's being forced to identify the fact that he is 100% disabled. People don't typically know that because he doesn't wear shorts to work, and you can't see what's inside his body, and you cannot see the fact that he has a trach tube scar and a scar all the way down his chest. So what is it that we can do in Texas to be able to, we're trying to secure and help our fellow Texans, right? But what is it that we can do to help our federal law enforcement? Because we have a whole bunch of federal law enforcement folks that are having trouble with this particular mandate. And then on top of that, people who are like my husband who are being forced to disclose a disability that they have, right? He got sent home last week because he couldn't find a COVID test. And as he was walking out of the office, he was very frustrated because he loves work. And he was very frustrated, and they were like, why are you going home? His supervisor said, why are you going home? And he said, they sent me home on leave because I can't find a stupid COVID test, because they stopped all of the rapid tests in our area. And he had to wait 5 days to get a test. So what is it that we can do on a state level to be able to help these folks who are struggling like this? Because we're not being offered help.
That's so deeply unfair. And I've heard many of the stories, and I want to thank you for sharing the story of your husband. And I just hate what position that's putting him in. And the stories that I've heard, the calls that I've taken, and none of that is to compare with your husband's sacrifice and service to our country and to our community, and I thank him deeply for that. One of the things that I would like, and I'll say this in closing, and kind of to the bigger issue, I think a lot of the discussion has been on like employer mandates in terms of the vaccines. Kind of ironic that we haven't fully vetted out, we're fighting the federal employer vax mandate, but then there's some calls for like a state employer vax mandate on the opposite direction. But I think, and tying to what Ryan said, and kind of to your point, ma'am, it's the individual liberty and it's the personal autonomy. And one of the things that I would like to see that our legislature meet now, because I'll say, and Kyle mentioned a Florida special session, there hadn't been the homework done now for the legislature to pass a bill. There's a lot of competing interest at stake. Nobody's sat around a table. Nobody's hammered this out. I think it's just, not realistic to say, oh, we just call special session and pass a bill. Well, that does what? How does it address your husband's issue? How does it address these other issues that are out there? The time is now to figure this out. And and for committees to meet and stakeholders to gather and you to have research and discussion and debate and to put forward a thoughtful solution that addresses the needs of Texas, we got to do that homework first before we can really take any kind of action. And I think that one of the critical pieces that has to exist has to be a protection for medical privacy and personal privacy, that for the employer, for the government, for the school, for the extracurricular activity, it's just none of your damn business. And so it's even unfair to have to ask somebody to disclose any of that. So I think that that's a critical component. I think that's a perspective that I hope that our policymakers would address. I don't have an immediate solution, but that's how I would kind of address your question there, is that persons like your husband, persons with other conditions, any of us who respect and value our own privacy should be able to have protections for that privacy. And I think that that's a critical component of being able to address this from a policy perspective. So thank you again for your question. And Kyle, Ryan, Rick, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for kicking off the Policy Orientation Conference. Thank you all for joining us. Would you help me in giving a round of applause for our panelists?